Okay, let me just introduce the session. Welcome everyone to this session. We will start right now, and we encourage you to share your questions and your thoughts on the panel uh, via the chat. Sorry, you can have the chat, you have the polls, and you have this section of Q&A where you can write your questions, and we all kind of vote them. And thank you so much for being here. I'll let you start.
Hi, let me share my screen. So my name is Eric, and I'm currently working for Yonsei University. I had experience working in a startup of machine learning. I also joined some blogs describing the problems of artificial intelligence. You're welcome to look at it. It's a compilation of cases in which artificial intelligence has been misused. And actually, we just finished a translation of a curriculum for a secondary school. So I'm going to share it with all of you. Let me stop the fractal. Oh, yeah, here. So this is a curriculum for students in secondary school without any need of hardcore math. And it's meant to introduce them to artificial intelligence and ethics. And this is my colleague, Jack.
Hi, so my name is Jack Fox-Keen. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a database and systems manager at a nonprofit organization called Reach Out and Read, where essentially we work with pediatricians to make sure that children between the ages of 0 and 5 have access to literature. And I just graduated from Florida State University with a degree in biomathematics and computational science. And I worked with Eric at the startup machine learning company, working on using artificial intelligence for humanitarian purposes. And yeah, that is who I am.
So in our work, sometimes we need to train products. Those products were purchased by other companies, and at some moment we found some problems with the bias. So today we want to describe you our situation as working in the actual industry, finding these problems, convincing the managers that it's an important problem, all these things. So Jack, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I will share my screen. Okay, so let's get into our slideshow mode. So yeah, so social bias in machine learning. So while working at our company, we started realizing that there was a lot of issues of what happens if a data set is biased, or if you're trying to look for the wrong question and then you're getting the wrong answer. And I started working on putting together a list of all these scenarios, similar to what Eric was doing, of when data collection or algorithm development results in a solution that oppresses a group of people. And so the first example is, this was published in Nature magazine in 2019. And so the title was Millions of Black People Affected by Racial Bias in Healthcare Algorithms. And so what this study showed was that there was racism in the decision-making software used by US hospitals, and then kind of discussed the ways to correct it. Oh, it's not going down. Oops. So the study was published in Science on October 24th, 2019, and concluded that the algorithm was less likely to refer Black people than white people who were equally sick to programs that were supposed to improve care for patients with complex medical needs. Hospitals and insurers use the algorithm and others like it to manage healthcare for over 200 million people in the United States every year. And so the researcher, Ziad Obermeyer, was studying machine learning and healthcare management at UC Berkeley, and his team was the team that found this problem while examining the impact of the programs that provide additional resources and closer medical supervision for people with multiple and overlapping health problems. And then what the researchers found was that the algorithm assigned risk scores to patients on the basis of total healthcare costs accrued in 1 year. And so the issue here is that this was the variable that they thought was going to be the most important, or was going to be one of the most important, was how much the healthcare cost was in the year before. And so this assumption seemed reasonable because it seemed like higher healthcare cost would be associated with greater healthcare needs. And in this data set, the average Black person that the scientists used had similar overall healthcare costs to the average white person. But then the problem was that looking closer at the data revealed that the average Black person was also substantially sicker than the average white person and had a greater prevalence of conditions such as diabetes, anemia, kidney failure, and high blood pressure. And so taken together, the data showed that the care provided to Black people cost an average of US dollars of $1,800 less per year than the care given to a white person with the same number of chronic health problems. So why would there be this discrepancy? So I just kind of want people to kind of brainstorm, like, why would looking at healthcare costs and thinking, well, if they have the same healthcare costs, they must have the same medical needs, or if they have lower healthcare costs, that means they have lower medical needs. What would cause this kind of discrepancy? And so the scientists speculate that there's reduced access to care due to the effects of systemic racism, ranging from distrust of the healthcare system to direct racial discrimination by healthcare providers. And then also, if you've ever, been below the poverty line, then you know that it's really expensive to go to a doctor if you don't have insurance. And even if you do have insurance, the copay, even if the copay is $40, that could be your week's worth of groceries right there. So
I think that this also for Latino families, we usually tend to, automedicate ourselves. We don't go that often to doctors unless we need it.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of studies showing that within the healthcare system itself, doctors are less likely to believe Black patients that Black patients are in pain, for example, and they're less likely to believe that women are in pain. And especially if you're a Black woman, it's just really, really difficult. So there are all these barriers and systemic racism that prevent people from going to the doctor even though they're sicker than the average person. And so because the algorithm assigned people to high-risk categories on the basis of previous healthcare costs, those biases were passed on in the results, and Black people had to be sicker than white people before being referred for additional help. Only 17.7% of the patients that the algorithm assigned to receive extra care were Black. And then the researchers calculated that the proportion would actually be 46.5% if the algorithm were unbiased. So Ziad and his team collaborated with the company to find variables other than healthcare cost that could be used to calculate a person's medical needs, and repeated their analysis after tweaking the algorithm accordingly. They found that making these changes reduced bias by 84%. So finding fixes for the bias in algorithms is not straightforward. And the solution is to rerun the algorithm with another variable. But the hard part is, what is the other variable? How do you work around the bias and injustice that is inherent in society? So I want to open this up for a quick discussion. Is what are oppressed groups that you can think of? And can people talk right now? Can they unmute themselves, Fernando?
Yes, but they have to ask for permission. If you want to talk to the speakers, please, in the right top of your screen, you must see a blue box that says share screen and video. You can click there if you want to share your audio and video.
So one group that I feel it's mostly ignored in Mexico is the indigenous community. Even asking them to have electricity is already asking too much in some cases.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm seeing, indigenous communities, definitely poor communities, women, females. Are there any other communities that, maybe you don't always think of that are oppressed in everyday society?
Maybe it's a good time for your story of your friend.
Kids is a good one. Yeah. So a good example is, when the pandemic started, restaurants shut down and water fountains shut down. And who do you think was most impacted by the closings of restaurants? All right. Well, so you might think that it might be the restaurant owner, which is certainly they were impacted by this. Obviously, people who go to restaurants were impacted, but the people who it was a life or death situation were actually homeless people, because homeless people depend on restaurants for the restroom and for water. And then so when all of the water fountains were covered and all of the restaurants were closed, homeless people had no access to fresh water. And so what happened where I was in Tallahassee, Florida, one of my friends who had been homeless realized that this was going to be a problem, and she started up a mutual aid group to distribute water bottles to all of the homeless people. Because of her experiences, she was aware that this was going to be a community that was going to be most impacted by the closings of these restaurants. So I say that to illustrate the point of, because she had been homeless, she was more likely to know what was going to affect homeless people. So, and another community that we don't always think of as being oppressed are prisoners and people who are incarcerated. So an example that I like to think of is, I have a friend who is in prison right now. And I have a friend who's in prison right now. And when we were discussing, at one point in my company, we were discussing how do we have access to data sets that are, public record that we can use. And then the thing is, in the United States, for prisoners have no privacy. And because they have no privacy, any letters that you write to prisoners are scanned and kept on a government database. And so there is this entire data set, but it's also a huge ethical concern, because is it ethically right that prisoners sacrifice all of their privacy when they're imprisoned? And so these are, again, things that unless you know somebody who's in the prison system, you don't realize how complicated it is to actually be able to write letters to them or anything like that. Or what the actual, detrimental effects of writing letters are. And, letters are always used against prisoners. So these are just kind of the two examples that I think of a lot of oppressed communities that are out of sight and out of mind. So oftentimes people don't think about them. And so, but there's always, this is really important, is to think about who are the people that we don't think about. So I will share my screen again. And so, yeah, so what are oppressed groups that you can think of? And then my next question is, I had to go back. So my next question would be, what are groups that can be affected by your own code?
I have a question for Fernanda. If I click on show results, everybody will see the results of the poll?
I'm not sure, actually.
Okay, I'm gonna click. Nothing happened. So
No,
the thing
I
is,
think only you can see the results.
okay, so the thing is, I was talking with a person in charge of working with a software. This software determines who in USA gets fellowships based on their classes that they are taking, and if the person is taking some classes for, English as a second language, then their classes are considered less important. And this person was telling me that, sometimes in the school, they have the same teacher, they are taking the same classes, the same test. It's just like this person have some classes in Spanish, but the same math classes, they are taking the same math classes as any other student, but their math classes are less important, and so they don't get the same fellowships or resources as other people. And so this is code that they actually wrote, an algorithm that they created, but they didn't realize that it was going to have this consequence. So if any of you is in the situation that you work for a company, so this is the question that I asked you. Is there any group that you think is going to be affected by the algorithm that you created? Because in our case, I cannot talk too much because this is a private company, but we were training an algorithm using images. I actually think that you're going to explain a little bit more about that later, right? So I'm gonna pause a little bit, but we were in this situation. We wrote code, we trained, we evaluate, and we found interesting population that was being targeted. But I'm gonna wait until Jack talks about it.
Yeah. And so another example is, this was a pretty famous example actually. Amazon was using a machine learning algorithm to filter through resumes. And then what happened was, because of the data it was trained on, where, due to systemic racism and, the patriarchy and sexism in the workplace, there are more white male programmers than there are any other group of people. And then so all the data that was available of resumes of employees was resumes for white male programmers. And then what happened was the algorithm learned that bias and actually started rejecting all resumes that had the word woman in it. So if it said woman in physics or women in STEM or women in lacrosse, all of those were automatically rejected because the algorithm was trained on data sets that showed that only white men can be programmers. So there's just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a famous example, but they started to use a machine learning algorithm in a university in USA to pre-scan applications for PhD. And after 10 years, they realized that the algorithm was accepting mostly a white male. So for 10 years, if you send an application to this school, usually you are expecting that the letter of recommendation is going to tell about your talent, etc. Well, the teachers didn't even get your letter of recommendation because an algorithm was pre-scanning and it was selecting whether you were enough white male or not. So, this is an example of an algorithm that was meant to simplify the work of teachers, but even though affecting people in an area that doesn't seem to be technology, it's just applying to graduate school in USA.
Yeah, so there's just a lot of examples of how these codes are built in with data sets that are biased or built in with variables that are biased, and built by people that are biased. So it's just really important to kind of keep all these things in mind. So we have another example, and this was a couple of years ago as well, but bias detectives, are trying to figure out how to ward off injustice. So this was an example of using machine learning algorithms in child welfare or, social workers who work on child abuse. And so in 2015, a worried father asked Rima Vathyanathan a question that still weighs on her mind. A small crowd had gathered in a basement room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to hear her explain how this software would tackle child abuse. And every day, the area's hotline gets dozens of calls from people who suspect that a child is in danger, and some of these are flagged by the call center for investigation. But the system does not catch all of the cases. So Vathyanathan and her colleagues were focusing on building an algorithm that would help catch those cases that slip through the cracks in the typical call center. Vathyanathan is a health economist who co-directs the Center for Social Data Analytics at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, and told the crowd how this algorithm might work. And so basically, as you all know, you would train the algorithm on a bunch of data. And some of this data would include family backgrounds and criminal records. And then this would generate risk scores when calls come in. And that could help call screeners flag which families they need to investigate. And then after Vathyanathan invited questions from our audience, the father stood up to speak. He had struggled with drug addiction, and social workers had removed a child from his home in the past, but he had been clean for some time. And so with a computer assessing his records and finding this history of drug addiction, and finding this history of having his children taken away from him, would all of the work that he had done to turn his life around mean nothing? And basically, would the algorithm be able to judge him fairly? And Vathyanathan had to think about that, because there wasn't a variable that would account for if somebody had been clean for a certain number of years. So that you need to go back and think about, how do I offset, like, yes, criminal records are a factor, and yes, previous visits from child social workers are a factor, but then you have to think about all these other factors, such as going through rehabilitation and the number of years being clean, and the number of years spent maybe in therapy, for example. Like, there are other factors that would need to be included to make sure that the algorithm was fairly assessing. And so actuarial tools for assessing criminality and credit risk have been around for decades, but as these data sets become more complex and the models become more widespread, it's becoming harder to ignore their ethical implications. And so right now in the United States, we have an issue where we have algorithms that police departments use to predict whether or not somebody is going to be a criminal. Like, and actually in Florida, in Tampa Bay, Florida, the police department works with the school to get access to children's records, and basically will show up at a child's house, a high schooler's house, and check on them. But the thing is that it doesn't really prevent that person from, doing anything. It just kind of creates this weird stigma. And there's also been an issue where, the data that is trained on doesn't include the fact that if you are a white man who is smoking marijuana, you're less likely to be arrested than if you're a black man smoking marijuana. So what you have is a data set that shows that black people are more likely to be incarcerated, but they're not actually committing more crimes necessarily. It's just that they're more likely to be arrested for the same crime that a white person does. And it's, like I said, the marijuana example is probably like the largest example that I can think of. So you have these data sets that are built in with racial bias and then are used to determine whether or not somebody's likely to commit a crime, whether or not somebody's likely to go back to jail, and this affects whether or not people can get parole. And then with credit risk as well, there's just a lot of algorithms that use zip codes to determine whether or not somebody will have a good credit score. And then so if you live in a lower income neighborhood, then it automatically will, dock your credit, or there's like, they're called proxies for credit score. So it's like the credit score has this one thing, the three main credit bureaus, but there are essentially like these alternatives that companies want to use to try to, insurance companies, for example, want to use to try to create their insurance policies. And then they end up using data that is very, very flawed. So there's all these ethical implications that are happening with this. And so computer scientists no longer have the choice but to be engaged now, and we can no longer just throw algorithms over the fence and see what happens. And so as Eric was hinting at earlier, we had an example where at our company, we were working on image recognition, and our images were white men, or were a lot of white people, and using cultural norms in the United States. So for example, you can see the hat here is just, this is a white man in a hat. And what happened was it struggled when fed information which it was not trained on, such as other ethnicities and other cultural norms. So in our case, it was basically people wearing sombreros, Mexican people wearing sombreros, and the algorithm didn't know how to recognize them because it didn't know how to recognize that type of hat. And even if you Google sombreros, you get these, images of white people pretending to be Mexican people wearing sombreros. So it's just, it becomes this very difficult thing where, essentially Google is even trained on, algorithm, or is trained on data that is biased. And
before moving that, I want everybody to realize that in this company, they have these Latino people that realize this problem. But if the company did not have any Latino, they will not realize that this is not a representative data set. So you can balance it, etc. But because the data set is not representative, this product will have gone to the market, and whenever somebody makes it use it, it will fail. Just like I remember when all these cameras that recognize you when you are when you are smiling, if I am next to a white person, usually the camera did not recognize me. Well, that will have happened again with this product. So this is a problem, because how can they know that the data is not representative if they don't know anything about Mexican culture? You see, it's easy to say, well, they should have made a better study. Well, but if there is no Mexicans there, how do they know that they are missing something? Just like how do we know that people in the streets are suffering? All these problems are hard because you need to deal with the unknown. Sorry, you can continue, Jack.
Yeah. And so this is, this is why we need to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workplace systems, especially in STEM. We need to have Black programmers, we need to have women programmers, we need to have Latinx programmers, and we need to have Indigenous programmers. Like, we basically need people from the communities that are most impacted by the activities of these programs to be involved in the creation of these programs. And so there's a couple of ways that people are trying to address this. And this is, one of these is the Data Nutrition Project, which basically creates a quote unquote nutrition label for data sets. And so it looks into, here you can see the little nutrition label says completeness, provenance, collection of socioeconomic bias, inaccurate prediction, description, composition, racial bias. Essentially, when you break it down, what it's looking at is different aspects of data, such as how it was collected, demographic representation of minorities, and financial ties to gathering the data. And so an example that I like to use is when I was working at the machine learning company, I was focused on doing research in suicide prevention and how we could use natural language processing for suicide prevention and electronic medical health records for suicide prevention. And what ended up happening is when you are focusing on electronic medical records, that is a subset of people who actually die by suicide. So now you're only getting data of people who have insurance, typically people who are white and middle class or upper class, and you're not including groups that either are uninsured or are undocumented or are less likely to go to seek mental health services because of cultural stigmas. I know my mom's family is from Colombia, and for a while there was a stigma around, something like depression. And there's a lot of different communities of color that still struggle with this kind of stigma. And so you kind of miss a whole group of people by focusing on electronic medical records. But if you don't include that, if you don't address that, then you're just going to create a suicide prevention tool that is only able to predict suicide for white middle class people. And so this is another tool called the What If tool. And I will actually, I'll go over it briefly, but I'm going to let Eric explain this. So the What If tool is available as an extension in Jupyter, Collaboratory, and the Cloud AI platform notebooks. And it's used to analyze regression models and classification models on data points, such as inputs directly from within the notebook. And a custom prediction function can be used to load any model and provide additional customizations, including feature attribution methods like SHAP, integrated gradients, or smoothgrad. And I will let continue.
So as Javier is saying, it's very important to understand your data set. And for example, you can work with tools that simplify the work of exploring your data set so that when you are working, you can perceive or analyze if there is any problem. What If tool can be used in Jupyter Notebook. Another tool that we found is the Fairlearn, which is meant to give you a lot of code to be able to understand if there are any problems with your data set. Actually, we also found some papers, for example, this one, in which they say how using GPT-2, you can analyze if a particular sentence is going to be racist or sexist. And using that information, you can choose a different output of your NLP project. Because there are different machine learning algorithms in different areas. Like, for example, maybe you are interested in computer vision, or maybe you are interested in NLP. We decided to collect different papers that might be useful for you in case that you are dealing with this problem. So I'm gonna share those papers in the comments here. Yeah. So this is a list of titles of papers. I cannot share them because these are 160. 1 second. Let me. Yeah, so this is a list of papers that might help you in your projects. So that, sometimes you will have to retrain everything. But retraining everything from zero takes time, and it might not be very popular with the owner of the company. So in these papers, you might find some techniques that allow you to correct those bias problems, either since the beginning, being very careful when you're working, or by adding post-process. And
yeah. Yeah, and so I will share my screen again. We also have another example. So we have the what if tool, and here is kind of it working in real time. And it's I recommend that everyone kind of look into it. It's a very interesting tool. And then we also have the AI Fairness 360. So this is an extensible open source toolkit that can help you examine, report, and mitigate discrimination and bias in machine learning models. And so this was developed by IBM. And so this actually, they have a demo here where you can choose a sample data set. And so let's, for example, use German credit scoring. And so this will predict an individual's credit risk. Next. And then after you choose your sample data set, you'll check for bias metrics. And then here you can see this breakdown of equal opportunity difference, average odds difference, disparate impact, and for different protected attributes such as sex and age. And then you can choose a bias mitigation algorithm. So this is not necessarily, changing the data, or this isn't about the data, this is more about actually how to change the algorithm. And so that's kind of a difference between the data nutrition project is focused on evaluating your data before you train your algorithm, and this is focused on once you've already have trained your algorithm. And so, reweighing the examples in each group would be an option. And then you can compare the original versus mitigated results, and you can see the differences here. So it is a really neat tool that I encourage everyone to look into. And actually, as I was looking into it, I realized that on Coursera, I don't know if you guys have ever taken classes on Coursera, but I love Coursera. And they actually have a course about detecting and mitigating ethical risks. And it's part of a series of courses in Certified Emerging Technologist Professional Certificate. And yeah, so that is, stop sharing. So that is what I have. And I think that's, yeah. And then I saw some questions. We had a question in the Q&A. And so Fernanda asked, or I think somebody else asked it, but Fernanda put it in here. What anti-discrimination standards do you recommend? Oh, there's some background noise somewhere.
Yeah, I can hear a background noise.
Oh, sorry, Fernanda. What anti-discrimination?
Sorry, that's me. Sorry.
Okay. What anti-discrimination standards do you recommend consulting to develop a policy in Mexico? Eric, I don't know as much about policies in Mexico, so do you want to tackle that question?
I have been living for 10 years in USA. I'm afraid I don't have the knowledge to answer that question. So what I can tell you, from our experience here that people says, yeah, let's avoid discrimination, but one thing is to have the law, and one thing is to actually practice it on the job, And something that we realize is that it's hard to even start a conversation about it because people is so familiar to a particular way of acting that they are scared that these new ideas are going to hurt them. Even dealing with bias in the AI company in USA was a bit of a problem because we have to say, hey, this product is not going to go it's not going to be sold to the company yet because we don't approve. We have some standards that are not being accepted. And how do you convince the owner of the company? How do you convince your manager that this product is going to hurt people in Mexico when they don't understand why this product doesn't work with people in Mexico? So I don't know too much about how to change things in Mexico, but I can tell you that it's not an easy talk. It's an important talk because if you don't step on your ground, if you don't stop the product, well, the product is going to be sold to a company and you don't have any control. You don't know when that product is going to go and be used in Mexico. So it's an important step that we need to do, but I don't have much. We can talk about our experience, but I don't have much information about how to answer that question.
Yeah, and actually, as we were talking about, the company that we worked at, at one point, our manager or boss said, well, what counts as discrimination changes every year. He made it sound like it was a trend. And what I tried to explain is that oppression is something that is systematic, that has been around for decades. Like racism has been around for centuries. It's not a newfangled concept. And my argument to him was, if you're trying to find a starting point of who is an oppressed group in your society, chances are it's whoever's living below the poverty line, because people who are poor are the people who are being oppressed. And they're usually people of color, they're usually indigenous people, they're usually people who are in the minority of a religious group. So in every society, there is a group of people who are living in poverty, and that would be a good starting point for, these are the people that need to be setting up these anti-discrimination standards when developing policies. So I hope that, does that kind of maybe provide some answer to, I think it was Javier's question? No, it was Alfonso's question.
Oh, Alfonso. Fernando Sanchez asked if you can share the link to the tool you were showing.
Yeah, yes I can. So let me go to home. Actually,
So Javier Bustos, in my experience, every machine learning model developer must be engaged with a clear business understanding, because business knowledge allows the data scientist evaluate if the training of the model is done correctly. Yes, but I think that our manager had a good understanding of the business. I feel like besides knowing where is the market gonna go, it's also important to recognize that bias is a thing, and what we produce is gonna affect people. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but I just feel like when you write code, you don't know what is going to be done with the program. So you need to be very careful to make sure that whoever uses that code will not be by mistake hurting somebody.
Yeah. So, there's, sorry, go on.
No, and we wanted to know if there was somebody in the community that is also working in a company, if they wanted to share any situation, if they had any direct question about their cases, keeping privacy. But so we wanted to make the remaining of the part open. If any of you have any experience dealing with actually correcting these data sets beyond what is done in school, in school they tell you what to do, but how do you find what parameters to use? How do you identify the population that can be hurt? Those are a little bit more complicated questions. So if anybody has any comment or any experience, you are welcome to share time in this meeting.
Yeah, and I think something I would also want to touch on with Javier, with the problem with the business understanding and business knowledge is, if you're focusing on the business knowledge, you're focusing on profits, and that you're focusing on the majority, because it's going to be more profitable to make a product that 90% of the population can use. But then that means that 10% of the population is still negatively impacted by this. And that's why I feel like you can't just focus on a business model, because if you focus on a business model, you're focusing on just profits in the majority.
The example is simple. The clients of the product that we created are going to be mostly in USA, but we still care about the Mexican community because it was going to get hurt. And so we definitely need to use other ways to prevent that what is considered a minority can be hurt. You see, maybe your product is very popular and it's being used around the world, and you never thought about who's going to be using it.
Yeah, and so it was actually Amazon. They had an image recognition software that was being used by police departments. And the images were, again, mostly white men. And so it was very inaccurate for predicting or for accurately identifying Black people and especially Black women. And then police officers were using this to arrest people. And so then the issue that you have is that you do have people who are, being very much negatively impacted by the results of this algorithm. Hi, Javier.
So,
Hi,
Hey,
hello.
Javier.
Javier, welcome.
Hello from Chile. So, yeah, I'm not 100% agree about what you say, because you say about a minority, about the model, what the model does. So, in my experience, that's why data scientists, we have a lot of metrics. For example, I'm in a anomaly detection model right now working, and we are not using accuracy in this moment,
Yep.
because accuracy is the wide view. In this case, we want to see anomalies. It's a very low percentage of the whole data. So in my case, we don't use, and manager doesn't want to use accuracy. We want to use precision, because it's the level that we are searching for. So what I want to say is that we don't only care about accuracy. We have multiple metrics in data science, but also the business understanding. Maybe for a vice president is always like, show me the money, show me the big numbers. But managers relies on with the data science teams on and search what we are looking for. We have to look at a balance between money and what we're looking for. So it's not only one metric. It's not only like.
Yeah, no, and I mean, definitely. For example, in this case of situation when there is no representability in the company, how do you assess that the product is not gonna work in Mexicans if there is no Mexican? There is no number of, there is no parameter that can tell you that kind of problems. I agree that there are definitely certain tools and there are certain ways to make sure that the product works. The problem that we have is that who is going to use the product and if it is going to work correctly with them, even though at this moment the company doesn't know about anything about this population. It's a little bit more about the application of the actual product rather than how to formally create, train, and test the product.
Yeah,
I don't know if. So I agree with you. The metrics is something you need to choose. You need to learn and study. The problem that we have is that the product became popular and went out of USA. And so if people in Mexico is going to use it, well, you don't have time to retrain it for Mexico, right? And then when it reach China, you don't have time to return it from China. So it's an interesting situation that a good product is facing. That now it's going to be used online. So this is how we started on this. But I agree with you. You need to be very careful. You need to study, and you need to choose how to train it. You need to ask the correct questions. Why accuracy?
Yeah, but I agree with you. Like, the 90% of the work in data science is the data. Like, the model is and nowadays it's even faster. It exists AutoML and some other software that do the modeling part. So the question that we have to think is more in the business, or keep in mind the business, like where we want to apply to is what we train for. Do we have that data? Do we have that information? And something that happens, we don't have the data and we can't continue the project because it doesn't solve the business problem that we want. So, yeah.
Yeah. Nowadays, machine learning, in my understanding, is moving towards the data. They call it data center machine learning or data-oriented machine learning. And you see, we were thinking about, all right, what does a big company do to solve this problem, right? Diversity, etc. But then what does a small startup can do? You see, you have a very good idea. You convince people to sponsor you. You create a product. The product is good. It starts to spread. And suddenly, people that you didn't know are using it. So this is a problem that a lot of small companies are facing, that their product is affecting a community they didn't plan it to use or they didn't even were aware of. You're an investor. You like this idea. You put your money. And then you realize online that everybody's saying that your product is racist. then your inversion is lost. So this is a serious problem. And especially for small companies, for small startups. How do they solve the problem? How do they get a data set representative enough from different countries? Like, why would a small company in USA care about Mexicans? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, there exists. I don't know. I can't remember the page, but there exists like a big data set around the web, like 20 millions or more about pictures of whatever you want. And I don't know, cactus people. I don't know. There's a lot. There's a big bank of data that it exists. Sorry. So that's one way. So in the computer vision way, there's exist data. You only have to find it on the web. And the second part, there exist techniques about that, like only in the computer vision side to keep in that track. There exist different techniques, oversampling, smooth. I don't remember two, but they exist bootstrapping, I think that also. But there exist a lot of techniques that you can use with the same data to achieve that goal, to do a better training. So there's multiple ways to get to the goal. I mean, so you can find from the web, you can retrain with changing a little bit training data in the unbalanced just say well populations. There exist some ways. So there exist different ways to do that.
No, yes. I mean, there are tools to solve a problem once you identify the problem. What I was saying is, if you are in USA and you don't know that your data set does not represent Mexicans, yeah, you're going to do everything to get the values that you need. But you didn't realize that the hats in Mexico are different. And how can you know it? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I, just kind of Javier, to kind of, when you were saying that every machine learning development model must be engaged with a clear business understanding, I think what we're trying to say is that you can't really have a clear business understanding unless you're working with groups that are going to be affected by that model, or if you're incorporating their needs. So I feel like that's just the part of what helps focus your business understanding. And that's how you know how to use these alternative techniques and focus on precision versus accuracy, and to look for alternative data sets. And to, but like if you, like Eric was saying, if you don't, if people don't think about homeless people, they're not going to think about how something is affecting homeless people. And I don't know about you, but most people I know really don't think about homeless people or incarcerated people because they don't interact with them on a daily basis. And so it's just important to kind of think about who's going to be impacted by the technology that you create.
Yeah, maybe it's something that we can only see after we do the deployment. We can see, maybe we can assume that it could happen something, but there are things in the monitoring after the deployment we can see. Like we have to keep very clear the stage of the data of a data science project and what are the challenges that we have to face in every step.
I don't know. Anybody else wants to join the?
Yes, please, if anybody else wants to join, just click on the blue box that says share screen or share audio, and you can come up. While that happens, I have a question.
Sure.
If you don't mind. Do you think it's possible to make it a huge algorithm that predicts for everybody? Or do you think we really have to make several algorithms, for example, one problem? I don't know. If we were going to create an algorithm to predict levels of education, for example, that it's something that I've been reading about. Do you think it's possible to make a huge, take a lot of data and create a huge algorithm, or do we have to make several algorithms to cover all these things that we could make differences?
Sorry, there is some noise in the background, like sun or something. It's a little bit hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry. Do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
Yes, I was asking, if, for example, you were trying to predict the level of education, like how far in school somebody went, and you need to know, like, yes, based on a lot of parameters. Do you think it's possible to have like one algorithm to predict for every population, like collect a lot of data? Or do you think you have to make several algorithms to be able to predict something like that?
So we work mostly with images, and sometimes the product works better if we have different products according to the specific characteristics. And sometimes we were lucky enough to create a product that works with all of them. I don't have more to say. I'm sorry.
I agree, Eric. Both ways are valid. It depends of the data science, the team, what track they want to do. Maybe they can test both and then get a final decision. But
So if I can give any answer that is technical, I will say nowadays people focus on having good data, and focus on making sure that the data is helping you, that there is not much noise. And if you have a problem and you want to improve it, work on the data. So maybe if you clean the data even better, any of these two options is going to work. But right now, maybe the problem is the data. That's the current moral status of.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone has it's a comment or question. We have 10 minutes left, so.
Or if you have any other recommendation about papers that might, especially if you find a problem with your algorithm, how to solve it in the most efficient way so that the company doesn't wait too much time, but also you produce something that is not going to affect people. It's not going to hurt all Mexicans, And maybe finally, I'm gonna make I'm gonna share the screen. This is not my blog, but this is something that might be useful for people. It's called Awful AI. It is a collection of cases in which AI was used or was misused. So these are things that end up being racist, sexist, problems with face recognition, Cambridge Analytica. So we are collecting cases of misuse. You're welcome to join us, or if you want to know more about possible misuses of AI, please feel free to visit it. It is not mine, but I collaborate with it, and you're welcome to give your opinion.
Thank you. Also, if anyone has not filled the poll yet, please feel free. I don't know if you want to say something about the previous results from the poll.
I cannot see them.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna tell them because I think you can only see them once you answer them.
Oh.
That's
because I didn't answer.
Yes.
Oh,
please.
I can answer it now.
If you want to see the answer, yes. If you want to see like the rates, you can answer them and then you can see the results.
Okay, this was just to make sure that there were people actually in companies that might face this problem, but I think this is also useful for people trying to, like if you want to create your company, well, make sure that your product will not be labeled as a racist product, because that is going to affect your inversion and your name. If you're a manager, well, make sure that you have a diverse team, because maybe they can see cases that you will not be able to realize. There is no textbook that tells you how to find if this is going to work with Mexicans.